So, and here's the coup overthrow, which Stephen Kinzer wrote a book, Overthrow, talks about I think 17 coups on this planet Earth at the behest of Allen Dulles. Would you mind to would you elaborate on this? The overthrows like Dr. Mossadegh, Patrice Lumumba, our bonds in Guatemala, and could you elaborate on this? And connected with the ruling class of American and the capitalists of the American society at the time.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Mossadegh in Iran, of course, was a democratically elected leader who represented the aspirations of the Iranian people.
And he was a constitutionalist. He wasn't any radical,
no,
not even social democrat.
They tried to tie him to the Communist Party in Iran and to the Soviet Union.
Tudeh.
Yeah, the Tudeh party. But he was actually at odds with the Tudeh party in great respects. And I think there was a great fear of the Soviet Union in Iran. No, what he was, there was a very touching letter that he wrote to President Eisenhower early on saying, complaining about British interference because, of course, there was a long history of British colonialism and British control of Iran's oil resources. And as he tried to break away from that and establish sovereignty over Iran's resources, of course, the British were resisting and interfering and undermining his government. And he wrote a letter because he still had faith in the United States government as a force for good. And he wrote a very touching letter to President Eisenhower right after Eisenhower's election saying, I understand that you're a longtime ally of Britain and I wouldn't be imposing on you normally, but my democracy is at stake here in Iran. And I know that you, as a decent person who supports democracy and justice, will come to our aid. And Eisenhower actually considered at least keeping a hands-off policy for a while in Iran. But the Dulles brothers once again intervened. They had represented British oil interests and American oil interests in the Middle East. They knew that Mossadegh represented a threat to those interests. So they persuade Eisenhower that Mossadegh is not only a threat to those corporate interests, which they, of course, can't base their argument entirely on that, but no, he's a communist, and he's a secret communist, and will be an ally of the Soviet Union, none of which is true. And so they began a campaign, a secret campaign to undermine his government, which results, of course, in the tragic events of 1953, and the Shah, he's overthrown, the Shah is reinstalled thanks to the CIA, and all democratic resistance is crushed brutally. Again, with CIA training, Iranian intelligence services under the Shah began a brutal and vicious crackdown. Savak, the intelligence agency in Iran, and so on. And again, this was all with the very firm support of the CIA. Now, this is repeated the next year in Guatemala. Jacobo Arbenz was really the Kennedy, the JFK of Guatemala. He and his wife, who are both a young, glamorous, very progressive couple, come to power, and they're very determined, despite their own privilege, their own family privilege, to help lift up the poor people of Guatemala. It's basically a medieval country that's under the boot of local oligarchy and of United Fruit, which is this major global agribusiness company that the Dulles brothers had represented as lawyers. And so when Arbenz says, well, you're not using some of this land, United Fruit, and you're not cultivating it, we're going to take some of this land for the poor peasants and redistribute it, that is the end for him. And again, they create a military coup. They back a military coup that overthrows Arbenz. And then they don't even leave him alone. The coup in 1954 in Guatemala leads to a terrible period of the killing fields of Guatemala. Peasants, farm worker activists, union leaders, opposition political figures are all rounded up. They're tortured, they're murdered, journalists. Arbenz and his family flee the country, and they're not given any peace, even in exile. Under pressure from the United States and the Dulles brothers, no country will take them in and offer them sanctuary. Finally, after traveling literally around the world, Arbenz, his daughter kills herself, the family's under great stress, and he ends up himself in a Mexico City hotel room, scalded to death in a bathtub. The authorities called it a suicide, but his family, of course, believes it was another CIA assassination. And then, of course, we have Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. Yes. So again, he's this great hope of Congolese freedom and independence. coming out of the brutal era of Belgian colonialism and repression. Finally, Patrice Lumumba is the first democratically elected leader of that country. And yet again, there are very big mining interests, a lot of mining and mineral resources in that country, represented by the Dulles brothers.
Today, yes.
And so when Patrice Lumumba again wants to establish sovereignty and control over those resources and implement a true democracy in his country, the Dulles brothers again portray him as a communist threat, which is untrue. They overthrow him with a military coup, and he flees for his life. He's tracked down and captured. And with the CIA involvement, and I think direction, he is brutally tortured and murdered. And later they said they had nothing to do with it, that it was his political rivals who killed him, which was literally true, but those rivals were being supported and subsidized and encouraged by the CIA. So the CIA again has blood on its hands in that case. Now, the remarkable thing, you had talked about how Dulles again and again defied presidents. They killed Lumumba just as President Kennedy was being elected in this country. The CIA wanted to have him killed before JFK came into the White House. Why? Because JFK had stated as a senator, and while he was running for president in 1960, that he supported African independence, he supported Third World independence, and they knew that once Kennedy was in the White House, that he might protect Lumumba. So they have him killed, the CIA, before Kennedy can do anything about it, and then they even keep that news from Kennedy for a full month. The CIA doesn't tell him. He finally learns from his own UN ambassador, not the CIA. And when he hears this, there's a famous picture taken of Kennedy in the White House. His face is crumpled in agony like this. And, this is the terrible legacy, once again, of the Dulles brothers undermining the new president, JFK.
And according to the laws, that's treasonous.
That's one word for it. Absolutely. Subversive, treasonous, definitely illegal. And Kennedy, right away, I think, began to realize what he was up against. He had made the fatal error of keeping Allen Dulles on as his CIA director because he thought he needed to communicate a sense of political continuity in Washington. He'd won, remember, the election by a very thin margin. He'd barely beat Richard Nixon. And he felt that he had to keep some Republicans in power, some of the old regime, like J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI and Allen Dulles at the CIA, to reassure America that he wasn't a young, inexperienced president, and that there would be older and wiser people in his administration. But that turned out to be a disastrous decision, because right away, at the Bay of Pigs, the CIA invasion of Cuba, he knows that he's been manipulated, he's been played by the CIA. They're trying to get him to expand this motley invasion of Cuban exiles into an all-out U.S. military assault on the island. And when he refuses to do that, the CIA and Allen Dulles are absolutely astounded that this young president stands up to them. Now, as I bring out my book, the same time that the CIA is trying to overthrow Castro in Cuba, they're also trying to overthrow our ally, President Charles de Gaulle in France, which is another remarkable story that's really never been told in this country, at least. And so JFK is having to deal with these two CIA crises at the same time. He had no clue about what was going on in France. Charles de Gaulle has become the target of right-wing military elements in his own military, who are upset with him for trying to settle the war in Algeria, which has been grinding on and on for years. And there's backlash from the right wing of his military. They announce a coup in Algeria. The French people, much like is going on today, it's a terrible crisis. They don't know when French paratroopers are going to be landing in France to take control of the government. The French government under de Gaulle is frantic. They go to Washington. What's happening? We've heard the CIA is backing this military coup. JFK is in the humiliating position of saying, I don't know. I am not backing this coup as president, but I have no control of my own CIA. That's what he has to tell them. So this is remarkable. And finally, Charles de Gaulle does succeed in rallying his own people who pour into the streets and a massive defiance of the French right-wing military coup, and the rebellious generals are forced to stand down. But this is, again, a shocking example of how the CIA operated on its own without presidential knowledge often and without presidential support.
As it's happening right now that the White House or the president is much controlled by the big corporations and by big businesses, international businesses, that they are controlling everything that happens. So according to Alan Dulles, it's like if you're not with us, you're against us.
That's right. It's the old George W. Bush line. And of course that sort of arrogance had its roots during the Cold War period of Alan Dulles.
Yeah.
There was no third way that was allowed. So nationalist leaders like those in Guatemala, Iran, and Congo who wanted to go their own way and just try to find a path that was most beneficial for their own people, apart from what was happening in the Cold War, they weren't allowed to pursue that third path.
May I ask you, since you have written the book and you have written, read a whole lot of material, especially the new materials that have been released as of Bill Clinton's, what do you call that? Releasing
the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act.
Yes.
Yes.
If you had to talk with Iranians and with Guatemalans and with Congolese,
Mm-hmm.
what would you tell them right now? What would you tell those people, that what did U.S. do at the time?
Well, I think what the United States needs to do at this point in history, and I think it would go a long way to diffusing some of the anger and tension in the world today, is to apologize for our past crimes as a nation, what we've done to these sovereign countries around the world, what we did to their infant democracies as they tried to develop. And the American powers, and these are political and corporate powers that have really run this country for so long, and just looking at the Dulles period, going back to World War II and the Cold War period and up through today, have done so much damage around the world. And that's what I think the American people don't understand, that there's a reason for this anger that we're dealing with today, and this militancy of younger generations. They know this history. They know that this heavy boot of American power that's been put on their countries, on the necks of their countries, and that has held back progress in those countries, and that has smashed democratic secular movements in those countries, and that has allowed for, in some cases, Islamic extremism to fill the vacuum.
And it has ruined life and actually derailed lives. If we had Dr. Mossadegh in Iran or Patrice Lumumba in Congo, who knows what would a democratic society produce?
Well, absolutely. And so there is the kind of ahistorical ignorance that unfortunately the American media is guilty of. American media never explains the wider context for events that are happening today in the war on terror, or why the rise of something like Islamic State and where that comes from. There's often, this is as a direct consequence of heavy-handed American intervention and interference in these countries. I mean, even with Islamic State, I was just, reminded that the people who were leading Islamic State were disaffected elements of the Iraqi military, who had nowhere to go after Bush and his proconsul, Paul Bremer, in Iraq, in Iraq after the invasion, basically dismantled Saddam's military. They had nowhere to go. So these are now the military leadership of Islamic State. So there's always a consequence for these imperial actions.
Yeah. You mentioned media, and I was going to bring this up a little bit later, but let's deal with that. You're talking about American media. Now, you've been shut out of American media as well with your book, and because New York Times, Washington Post, and Politico, as far as I know, they have not done a book review on you, and they won't actually let you write anything about your own book. Could you explain that, and why are they doing what they're doing?
Well, a democracy depends on a free media, depends on open dissent, a free exchange of ideas, and so on. And yet, in this country, we see the limits of that all the time. That there are major intellectual figures who should be part of this discourse right now, Noam Chomsky being one of the primary examples.
You yourself.
Or myself, or Chris Hedges, or people like this who do have a deeper understanding of this history, and we need to hear these voices. So yeah, with my book, the New York Times has not yet reviewed it, and if they do review it, I'm sure it will be very critical. I can be certain of that. The Washington Post has actually even told my publicist they will not be reviewing my book. Politico was all set to do an excerpt by me or an essay based on my book.
Al Jazeera.
And they bumped me at the last minute, Politico, and instead ran a piece by a journalist who was using documents leaked by the CIA and had a very, I think, very skewed version of this history that we're talking about today in Kennedy and Cuba. Al Jazeera America. I was scheduled to go on TV. I was literally on my way to the studio, and my publicist got an email saying, "Oh, it's been canceled," and he was obviously surprised and said, "Why?" And he got a one word response in the email: politics. So if even Al Jazeera America is intimidated, then you know that really the kind of what's allowed to be discussed in this country is becoming narrower and narrower.
Well, I hope they don't call you a self-hating American.
I'm sure that's next.
That's awful. So let me, would you like to talk about JFK assassination and the Dallas involvement and Dallas involvement? Or
yes.
Briefly, because I got two more questions for you.
Sure, okay. Well, look, speaking of media taboos, American taboos, the JFK assassination remains one of the greatest taboos in American public life. It's now very clear from any all the recent research that's been done, some of it's based on documents that have been released by the U.S. government itself, and some of this based on our own congressional investigation that was undertaken by the House Select Committee on Assassinations back in the 1970s. From all these various sources, we now know, I think beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the assassination of President Kennedy was a conspiracy. This is what Congress itself declared in the 1970s. And not only that, but this conspiracy really came out of the U.S. government itself. And what I argue in The Devil's Chessboard is that it was led by people like Allen Dulles, who had been fired by Kennedy, was very bitter about it, felt that Kennedy was a weak president who was putting the country at risk. Why? Because he was negotiating with the Soviet Union. He was negotiating with Fidel Castro in Cuba. He believed in diplomacy instead of war. And for this, they felt he had to be removed. So Allen Dulles, I believe, was the so-called chairman of the board of this conspiracy. Indeed, it was his assassination team that he had built while he was CIA director that came back to Dallas to kill our own president. They had killed foreign leaders all around the world. It's not such a big leap to have the same team come back to Dallas. I, through new evidence, place a key member of that team, in fact, the leader of that team, a man named William Harvey, who was a CIA official, a legendary official in the CIA. Allen Dulles had promoted him, made him head of the assassination team directed at Fidel Castro. He was a man who was comfortable working with the mafia. I believe, and I have new evidence to show this, that he was in Dallas before the assassination in November 1963, and that he and others on his assassination team, CIA assassination team, played a key role in killing President Kennedy. And then, of course, Allen Dulles has conveniently put on the Warren Commission, the commission that investigates the murder of the president.
The Foxes.
The Foxes, again, looking into who murdered the hens.
Yeah.
And he dominates that commission to such an extent that many observers of the time felt it should have been called the Dulles Commission. And of course, they conclude it was Lee Harvey Oswald, this lone nut, acting alone. All evidence points to a conspiracy in many ways. Of course, we know the doctors who worked on President Kennedy at Parkland Memorial Hospital saw evidence of wounds in his throat, gunfire from the front as well as the back. Lee Harvey Oswald, unlike most assassins, said all along, I didn't do it, I'm a patsy. I think he was connected in some low-level way to U.S. intelligence. And he knew, he was shrewd enough to realize that he was being set up and used. And so he screamed out to the press, "I'm a patsy." I think he was a patsy. I think he was in way over his head, as his wife Marina later said. And I think he was used by U.S. intelligence. And as Senator Richard Schweiker, who was on the Church Committee that first looked into the Kennedy assassination back in the 1970s, later said very, I think, astutely, when you look at Lee Harvey Oswald, you see the fingerprints of intelligence all over him.
I want to leave rat lines out. I want to leave the, because it's well written, and I mean, you have delved into this part as well, the Nazi, heads of Nazi party moving to Vatican, to Latin America, to
the rat lines.
Not to be personal. But here's what I like. What do you tell American people and other people in general, especially Americans? How do you see where things like this shadowy government are lurking behind things? How do we spot that? How do we see that coming to us so we can prevent this from happening again?
Well, for one thing, you see how whenever there's a crisis, who is put on television to speak about it?
Generals.
Right, generals, people who are with these foundations and think tanks that are connected to the Pentagon and the CIA. And so you see the same cast of people again and again. And these are the people who argue for more war, for more bloodshed, for more repression, for more police state measures. Hang Ed Snowden by the neck, as James Woolsey, the former CIA director, said. And of course, whenever something like this happens, they come out and use it as a pretext to demand more repression and to crack down on whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are the last vestige of American democracy. They're the only reason we get any truth about what's happening in the shadowy secret government. And so instead of being turned into heroes, as they are, of course, they're turned into demons and villains. So whenever you see people who are speaking like that, you know they're part of this network. These are the people who are subsidized by these think tanks, these corporations, these right-wing militaristic forces within American society. And that's who America has to fight against. We have to demand more transparency, not less. We have to demand peaceful resolutions to these crises around the world. We have to have more cultural understanding in this country. Americans are woefully ignorant about the rest of the world. We need more history. We need more diplomacy.
And talk to people who want to read your book and who need to read your book, and they must read your book. Talk to them.
Well, it's the backstory to everything we're going through right now. It's the backstory about why we're permanently at war, why we're permanently under the spying eyes of a big brother like state. It didn't begin with 9/11. It began years before that, during the Cold War. And so for Americans to know where we're headed in the future, to own the future, we have to own our history. And this history is often kept from us. You know, the CIA refuses to release, to this very day, thousands of documents related to the Kennedy assassination. That's in direct defiance of the law. There's a federal law known as the Jfk Records Act that was passed back in 1992 that compels all federal agencies to release every document that might be connected to the Kennedy assassination. There are at least 1,100 very key documents the CIA is still withholding in defiance of that law. We can begin as American people by demanding our congressional representatives to force the CIA to abide by the law and release those. And if not, a whistleblower at the National Archives or within the CIA itself should abide by the law and leak those documents to responsible people in the press. So, you know, Americans need to be more engaged. We need to not just respond to whatever campaign of fear that is unleashed on us. There's always, of course, going to be terrible things happening in the world, like just happened in Paris. But instead of being manipulated and exploited, instead of having those kind of tragedies exploited by these mongers of fear and war, we should, push back and say, no, we want the full story of what's happening here. We want to know why these terror attacks occurred. We want to know the history and the roots of Islamic State, and to what extent is the West, and the United States in particular, responsible for this.
I want to thank you very much for the time you allowed me to have this dialogue with you. You are a great man of history, and everybody should read your book. Your book is a fascinating read. It's a 500, 600 page plus, that it's a page turner. It's unbelievable. It's just like you write history so vividly in front of our eyes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mansour. My pleasure.